On a cold Edinburgh morning in May 1963, a woman stepped from a chauffeured limousine outside the Court of Session, adjusted her three-strand pearl necklace, and walked through the courthouse doors with the composure of someone who had spent her entire life being looked at and had decided, long ago, that she would never be the first to flinch. Inside, Lord Wheatley had been reading his judgment for more than 4 hours. The document ran to 160 pages. What it contained had already leaked to every newspaper in Britain. The photographs, stolen from a locked drawer in her private home, exhibited in open court, examined by a Scottish judge in a wood-paneled room built in an era when the word Polaroid had not yet been invented, had become the most talked-about images in the country. The country, and through the country, the world. The woman in the photographs wore nothing except her pearls. When Lord Wheatley reached his conclusion, he delivered it with the particular relish of an institution that has spent centuries deciding what women are permitted to be. She is a highly sexed woman who has ceased to be satisfied with normal sexual activities and has started to indulge in disgusting sexual activities to gratify a debased sexual appetite. A completely promiscuous woman whose promiscuity had extended to perversion and whose attitude to the sanctity of marriage was wholly immoral. The press was waiting outside. She walked out the same way she had walked in. Three-strand pearls. Head up, not flinching. They called her the Dirty Duchess. And Margaret Campbell, born Margaret Wigham, debutante of 1930, the most photographed woman of her generation, the woman mentioned by name in a Cole Porter song, the woman who had once stopped traffic in Knightsbridge for 3 hours simply by getting married, accepted the name the way she accepted everything, publicly, without apology, and on her own terms for as long as that remained possible. What happened to her after that morning is the part of the story that nobody who enjoyed the scandal bothered to tell. And it is darker than anything in the photographs. Subscribe to the channel right now. Because the story of the Dirty Duchess is not the story the 1963 newspapers told. It is something considerably more complicated and considerably more relevant to the world we live in now than most people are comfortable admitting. She was born Ethel Margaret Wigham on the 1st of December, 1912, in Newton Mearns, Renfrewshire, Scotland, the only child of George Hay Wigham, a self-made Scottish millionaire who had built his fortune through the Celanese Corporation, a manufacturer of artificial silk, and his wife Helen, a woman whose relationship with her daughter would be described by people close to the family as simultaneously obsessive and corrosive. Helen Wigham was beautiful. She was also a mother who managed her daughter's appearance with a precision that left no room for the daughter to simply be a child. She rationed Margaret's reading in case it caused her to develop a need for glasses. She monitored her diet. She organized her clothing. She presented Margaret to the world as a project and found it difficult to separate the project from the person, which is a specific kind of maternal damage that leaves marks that no amount of subsequent glamour fully covers. George Wigham, by contrast, doted on his daughter completely. He believed in her with the uncomplicated faith of a man who saw her clearly and liked what he saw, who was not, unlike her mother, measuring the distance between what Margaret was and what she ought to be. George was the parent Margaret would spend her life trying to please, and her mother the one she would spend her life trying to escape, which meant that her relationship with approval, specifically the approval of powerful men who found her beautiful and interesting, was established on its foundations before she left childhood. The family moved to New York City when Margaret was still young, and she spent the first 14 years of her life there, educated privately at the Hewitt School, developing the specific mixture of American informality and European social ambition that would make her so difficult to categorize and so impossible to ignore. She was, by all accounts, astonishing to look at from an extraordinarily young age. Not merely pretty in the way that many girls are pretty, distinctly, arrestingly, inconveniently beautiful, the kind of beauty that draws rooms to attention and that men, even men who know better, treat as a form of invitation. She was 15 years old when David Niven, then 18, seduced her during a holiday on the Isle of Wight. She became pregnant. The family moved swiftly and discreetly. George Wigham's money, making the problem disappear in the way that money makes certain problems disappear for the people who have enough of it. An illegal abortion at a private London nursing home. All hell broke loose. The family cook, Elizabeth Duckworth, remembered. Margaret did not mention this in her 1975 memoirs. She would continue to adore David Niven until the day he died, attending his London memorial service as a VIP guest decades later. That episode, At 15, with a man 3 years older, handled by her parents with secrecy and cash rather than with any form of justice, established another pattern. What happened to Margaret's body was managed by other people for the convenience of other people. What she felt about it was not the relevant consideration. Leave a like right now, because understanding what happened at 15 is essential to understanding everything that followed, including the photographs and the judgment and the pearls she wore when she walked out of that courthouse. In 1930, Margaret Wigham was presented at court at Queen Charlotte's Ball, the ritual through which British high society formally acknowledged that a girl had become a woman available for marriage. She was named Debutante of the Year, not merely a socially significant honor, but a genuine cultural phenomenon of that era, the equivalent in its context of winning a competition that the entire class system had organized itself to produce. She was 18 years old. She was already engaged to the Earl of Warwick. The engagement was cancelled when Margaret decided she was not sufficiently in love with him, a decision that the Earl's own mother had essentially predicted. "If you love your daughter, don't let her marry my son," she had warned Helen Wigham. "He's a liar, he's ill-mannered, and he picks his nose." By the time Margaret was 19, she had been engaged 4 times. She had conducted affairs with Prince Ali Khan, the millionaire aviator Glenn Kidston, the publishing heir Max Aitken, and Prince George, Duke of Kent, a roster that speaks not simply to her desirability, but to the specific world she inhabited, a world in which the most powerful and glamorous men of the era moved through the same rooms she moved through and responded to her in the predictable way. Cole Porter put her in a song. In the British version of "You're the Top," the line went, "You're Mrs. Sweeney," a reference to the name she was about to take from her first husband. The lyric was not presented as satire. It was presented as a compliment. She was genuinely at the top. She married Charles Francis Sweeney on the 21st of February, 1933, at the Brompton Oratory in Knightsbridge, having converted to Catholicism for the occasion, because Sweeney was a devout Catholic and Margaret had decided she wanted to marry him more than she wanted to remain Anglican. The wedding dress was designed by Norman Hartnell. The train was 28 feet long. The crowds that gathered outside to see her were estimated at 20,000 people. They blocked the traffic in Knightsbridge for 3 hours. 20,000 people came to watch a woman they had never met walk into a church in a dress. That is the measure of what she was in 1933. Not just beautiful, not just rich, but something the public of that era treated as almost mythological. The perfect society girl arrived at her appointed destination, becoming the perfect society wife. The marriage was not a fairy tale. Margaret suffered 8 miscarriages and a stillbirth alongside the 2 children who survived, a daughter, Frances, and a son, Brian. She would later describe Sweeney with the precision of someone who has had years to distill a complicated feeling into a simple sentence. All Charlie wanted in a wife was a pretty, brainless doll. What Charlie wanted and what Margaret were not compatible. She was not brainless. She was sharp, observant, socially intelligent in ways that her world rarely gave her credit for, because social intelligence in women of that class and era was categorized as manipulation rather than capability. She had opinions. She had preferences. She had desires that extended beyond the role of decorative consort to a successful man. And in 1943, something happened that would become one of the most debated and most exploited facts of the entire subsequent scandal. She fell 40 feet down a lift shaft. The fall was at a private house. It was nearly fatal. She survived, but the physical consequences were severe and lasting. She lost her sense of smell. She lost her sense of taste. And something shifted in her personality, or rather, something that had always been present became more pronounced and less restrained. Whether this was neurological, as some medical accounts suggested, or whether it was simply a brush with death producing the clarifying effect that near death sometimes produces, the removal of the anxiety about consequences that governs most people's behavior, is impossible to determine from this distance. What is not in dispute is that after the fall, Margaret Sweeney's life became significantly less organized around restraint. During the marriage, the affair with Prince George had presumably ended when he died in an air crash in 1942. But the general pattern of seeking connection, admiration, and intimacy outside the boundaries that the marriage was failing to provide continued and accelerated. The marriage to Sweeney formally ended in divorce in 1947. All Charlie wanted was a pretty, brainless doll. She had said it. She left. The years between 1947 and 1951 were, by Margaret's own account, among the most actively enjoyable of her life. She maintained her position in society. She was briefly engaged to Joseph Thomas, a Texas-born banker at Lehman Brothers, who then fell in love with another woman. A rebuff that would have been humiliating for most people, but which Margaret apparently absorbed as simply the nature of things. She had a serious romantic relationship with Theodore Rousseau, curator of paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whom she described as highly intelligent, witty, and self-confident to the point of arrogance, but whom she decided was not suitable as a stepfather. She was 37 years old, twice unlucky in love, and in possession of a fortune, a social position, and a face that the cameras still sought every time she walked into a room. And then, on a train from Paris back to London, she met a man. Subscribe right now, because the story of what Ian Campbell, Duke of Argyll, did to Margaret, and what she did to Ian Campbell, Duke of Argyll, is one of the most perfectly matched disasters in the history of aristocratic marriage. Ian Douglas Campbell was the 11th Duke of Argyll, a Scottish nobleman descended from one of the great Highland families, the owner of Inverary Castle in Argyll, and a man who, behind the title and the castle and the ancient lineage, was an alcoholic, a gambling addict, and addicted to a stimulant drug called dronamyl, a combination of amphetamine and barbiturate known colloquially as Purple Hearts. His first two wives had described him as physically violent. He was massively in debt. The castle, which was the physical expression of everything his title represented, was crumbling and could not be maintained without an injection of money that he did not have. He had been previously married twice. Both marriages had ended in divorce, with credible accounts of abuse from both women. He had been described by people who knew him as charming in the way that certain dangerous men are charming, which is to say, convincingly, until the moment the charm was no longer useful. Margaret saw the castle. She saw the title. She saw what he represented in the specific social currency she had spent her entire life accumulating. And she saw, perhaps, something that her own childhood had conditioned her to recognize without fully interrogating. A powerful man whose approval felt important, whose interest felt validating, and whose flaws were large enough to be legible but not, in 1951, large enough to override everything else. They married at Caxton Hall Registry Office on the 22nd of March, 1951. She became the Duchess of Argyll. He received, through her money and the money she persuaded her father to contribute, a significant financial rescue for Inverary Castle, a rescue that one of her biographers, Lindsay Spence, documented with particular care, noting that the Duke had forged a deed of gift offering castle assets as security before the marriage in order to obtain her money. He was, from the beginning, defrauding her. He also wiretapped her car. In a marriage defined by mutual suspicion, mutual infidelity, mutual litigation, and the specific toxicity of two people who are equally matched in stubbornness and equally unsuited to each other in every other way, the surveillance of his wife's vehicle is almost a domestic detail. But it is worth dwelling on, because it establishes something important about the power dynamics of what was about to happen. Ian Campbell was not a passive victim of a faithless wife. He was an active participant in a war of mutual destruction, with every advantage of the law, the class system, and the courts on his side. By 1954, according to Margaret's own later admission, she was conducting affairs. The marriage had essentially ended in practice, though not yet in law. The Duke continued his own infidelities, which were extensive and documented but would never be mentioned in any court proceeding. In 1959, he filed for divorce. The legal proceedings that followed were the longest, most expensive, and most salacious divorce case in British legal history, and they produced, eventually, the photographs. The photographs had been taken with Margaret's consent, by or for Margaret, in her Art Deco-style bathroom at her private home at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street, Mayfair. They were Polaroids, a technology so new in the early 1960s that one of the arguments the press would later use to identify the man in them was that only certain categories of person would have had access to a Polaroid camera. They were stored in a locked drawer. They were personal documents of a private woman's private life. Ian Campbell hired a locksmith and broke into the drawer. The photographs showed Margaret wearing nothing except her 3-strand pearl necklace. Some showed her with a man whose face was not visible in the frame. The angle captured everything below the neck and nothing above it. The man was immediately dubbed the Headless Man by the press. There were 4 photographs of this man, each with handwritten captions that Margaret had written herself: before, thinking of you; during, Oh, finished. The captions, when they became public, were treated as evidence of depravity. They are, in any honest reading, evidence of a woman who was comfortable with her own sexuality and had no reason, in the privacy of her own locked drawer, to be otherwise. The Duke submitted the photographs as evidence in the divorce proceedings. He also submitted a list of men he claimed had been his wife's lovers during the marriage. The list contained 88 names. The press reported this figure with the breathless enthusiasm of an institution that had been handed exactly the story it wanted. The trial became a national event. Details of Margaret's intimate life were read aloud in court, reprinted in newspapers, discussed in offices and drawing rooms across Britain. The specific acts depicted in the photographs were described in judicial language that simultaneously expressed moral horror and ensured that the maximum possible number of people understood exactly what had occurred. The Duke's infidelities, which were real, documented, and extensive, were not mentioned during the proceedings. The judge did not find it relevant to address them. The law of the land, as interpreted by Lord Wheatley in 1963, was not concerned with what the Duke had done. It was concerned with what the Duchess had done. And what the Duchess had done, in the judgment's language, was to exhibit a debased sexual appetite. Comment below, because what was done to Margaret Campbell in that courtroom is one of the clearest examples in the 20th century of a legal system being used not to adjudicate a dispute, but to punish a woman for being exactly what it had always permitted men to be. And I want to know whether you think anything has actually changed since 1963. The identity of the headless man became the obsession of the British press for months. Lord Denning, who had been commissioned to investigate the Profumo scandal that broke just weeks after the Argyll judgment, was also tasked with identifying the man in the photographs. He devised a method. He invited the 5 key suspects to the Treasury on the pretext of needing their help with a very delicate matter. When they arrived, they signed the visitor's register. A graphologist compared their handwriting to the captions Margaret had written on the photographs. The result was conclusive. The handwriting matched Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the American actor, the son of one of Hollywood's founding stars, the man who had been a decorated naval officer during the Second World War and who moved easily through the same transatlantic social world Margaret inhabited. A Channel 4 documentary in 2000 revisited the investigation and suggested that Duncan Sandys, the conservative defense minister and son-in-law of Winston Churchill, who had offered his resignation when the scandal broke, may also have been involved, though the official conclusion pointed to Fairbanks. The headless man question consumed enormous amounts of press attention. The real question, why a man's stolen, private, intimate photographs were being submitted as evidence in his wife's divorce case, examined by a government investigator and debated in Parliament, received rather less. Details of the Duke's infidelities were not mentioned during the proceedings. He was also not questioned about the theft and display of Margaret's private photographs, which by modern legal definition would be considered revenge pornography. The law that prosecuted her for what was in those photographs did not recognize that obtaining and publicizing them without her consent was itself a crime. It would be decades before that recognition arrived in British law, and by then Margaret Campbell had been dead for years. She did not fade quietly. She wrote her memoirs, published in 1975, called Forget Not, a title that reads, in retrospect, as exactly the declaration it was intended to be. She gave interviews. She continued to appear in public. She maintained, with a consistency that her enemies found infuriating, the position that the judgment against her had been unjust, and that she had done nothing that her husband had not done more extensively, and with considerably less stigma. She was right, and in 1963, being right was not enough. The decade that followed the divorce was a slow demolition. The title remained. She was still, technically, the Duchess of Argyll for the rest of her life, Ian Campbell having died in 1973. The social position did not remain. The invitation slowed and then stopped. The world that had built itself partly around her glamour discovered that glamour, when it is inconvenient, can be reclassified as something else entirely. Her finances deteriorated. The expensive lifestyle that she had maintained throughout her adult life, the houses, the clothes, the entertaining, the maintenance of the kind of appearance that her social world treated as a professional obligation, continued even as the money that funded it began to run out. She contributed columns to Tatler magazine. She opened her London home for paid tours. She wrote a book about how to throw a good dinner party, which Claire Foy, preparing to play her in the 2022 BBC series A Very British Scandal, noted with characteristic accuracy. She wrote a book about how to throw a good dinner party. No one wants to know about that. Everyone wants to know about the salacious elements of the divorce. In 1978, unable to maintain her Grosvenor Street home, she moved to a suite at the Grosvenor House Hotel. In 1990, she was evicted from the hotel for failing to pay her bills. Her family and her first husband, Charles Sweeney, the man she had called brainless for wanting her to be a doll, rallied around her. They put her up in an apartment. They eventually arranged for her to move into a nursing home in Pimlico. Margaret Campbell, Duchess of Argyll, died on the 25th of July, 1993, in that nursing home, following a fall. She was 80 years old. She was buried at Brookwood Cemetery in Woking, Surrey, beside Charles Sweeney, the man whose name Cole Porter had written into a song, the man whose wife she had been for 14 years, the man she had called brainless and who, in the end, helped pay for the apartment where she lived out her last years. The symmetry is almost unbearable if you look at it directly. The woman who had been at the top ended in a nursing home in Pimlico. The woman whose wedding dress had stopped traffic in Knightsbridge died in a room paid for by the generosity of the people she had left behind. Share this video now, because the ending of Margaret Campbell's story is the part that the scandalmongers never told, and it says more about what really happened to her than anything in those photographs. There is a specific quality of British institutional cruelty that operates through the language of propriety. It does not attack directly. It does not make its prejudices explicit. It uses the vocabulary of morality and tradition and the sanctity of marriage to do what it would be embarrassing to say plainly. That women are permitted to be beautiful and to attract men, but not to want those men. That they are permitted to be glamorous, but not to be sexual. That they may participate in the world of power and money and aristocracy as decorative appendages, but that the moment they claim any of the privileges of that world as their own right, the world will take away everything it previously offered and add a label to make sure the taking away feels earned. Margaret Campbell was beautiful. She used that beauty. She enjoyed the attention it brought. She was, in the specific language of her era, a highly sexed woman, which meant, translated into plain English, a woman who had desires and acted on them with the same freedom that the men in her life acted on theirs, without the guilt that was supposed to make that freedom feel wrong. For this, she was named the Dirty Duchess. For this, a judge spent 4.5 hours reading a 160-page condemnation of her character into the record of the Court of Session. For this, her stolen private photographs were displayed in open court while her husband's infidelities were not mentioned. For this, she ended her life in a nursing home in Pimlico after decades of social and financial erosion. Ian Campbell, the Duke of Argyll, whose documented alcoholism and drug addiction and violence toward his previous wives and fraud against Margaret herself were either not introduced as evidence or not considered relevant by the court, died in 1973. His obituaries described him as a Scottish nobleman who had worked to preserve Inverary Castle. The castle, the title, the lineage, all of these persisted. What had been done to obtain them was beside the point. In 2022, the BBC series A Very British Scandal, starring Claire Foy as Margaret and Paul Bettany as the Duke, reintroduced the story to a generation that had not lived through it, and received immediate critical recognition for the specific reading it offered of what the case had actually been about. Not a promiscuous woman getting what she deserved. A woman being systematically destroyed by an institution that found her inconvenient. Foy, in interviews, described her approach to the role with precision. The facts about her really were that she was very entitled, privileged, and she came from a background where she got whatever she wanted from the men in her life, then married a man who refused to give her anything. Viewed through a contemporary lens, the production noted, what had been done to Margaret amounted to institutional slut-shaming, the publication of what we would now call revenge pornography, and the systematic application of a legal and social system designed to punish women for the same behavior it rewarded in men. The Profumo scandal broke 2 weeks after Lord Wheatley's judgment. John Profumo resigned in June 1963 after admitting he had lied to Parliament about his affair with Christine Keeler. The affair itself, a Secretary of State for War sleeping with a woman who was also sleeping with a Soviet naval attaché, consumed the government and the press for months and was eventually the subject of its own inquiry. Profumo was not called a dirty duke. Profumo was described, ultimately, as a man who had made mistakes and who spent the decades after his resignation doing charitable work that eventually led to his rehabilitation. He was rehabilitated. He was invited back to public functions. He died in 2006 and received obituaries that called him a man who had redeemed himself through service. Margaret Campbell died in a nursing home in Pimlico and was buried beside the first husband she had publicly called insufficient. The difference between those two endings is not a coincidence. It is the entire story compressed into a comparison. What was Margaret Campbell? She was a woman who was raised to be beautiful and who used beauty with the same strategic intelligence that the men in her world used money. She was a woman who had been sexualized at 15 by a man older than her, whose pregnancy had been terminated secretly, and who had never been asked how she felt about any of it. She was a woman who married twice in search of something she described in different ways in different interviews: affection, security, excitement, love, and who found it, or approximations of it, in a number of places that her society designated as inappropriate. She was also, and this deserves to be said plainly, not a simple victim. She could be manipulative. She could be cruel. She forged letters during her marriage. She made accusations about her husband's children from a previous wife that were motivated by spite as much as by any belief in their accuracy. She was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, a complicated person, someone whose formidable qualities and whose considerable flaws were both real and both consequences of the same upbringing, the same world, the same set of rules that told her beauty was power and then punished her for using it. The tragedy of Margaret Campbell is not that she was a good person who was treated badly, though there was real injustice in what was done to her. The tragedy is something more specific. She was a woman of genuine intelligence and capability who lived in a world that had no use for those qualities except as accessories to her appearance, who organized her life around the only currency that world would accept from her, and who discovered, at the end, that the currency could be devalued by a man with a locksmith and a stolen drawer full of Polaroids. She had said, in one of the more honest assessments of her own life, "I had wealth, I had good looks. As a young woman, I had been constantly photographed, written about, flattered, admired, included in the 10 best-dressed women in the world list, and mentioned by Cole Porter in the words of his hit song, 'You're the Top.' The top was what I was supposed to be. I had become a duchess and mistress of an historic castle. My daughter had married a duke. Life was apparently roses all the way. Apparently. The word carries everything. Not actually roses. Apparently roses. The careful maintenance of a surface that the world wanted to see. The performance of the life she was supposed to have. And underneath it, the 40-foot fall down a lift shaft, the 8 miscarriages, the divorce proceedings that took everything she had built and displayed it in court, the slow financial erosion, the nursing home in Pimlico. She would have hated the sympathy. She had made a point, her entire life, of not inviting it. But the sympathy and the reckoning are not the same thing. The reckoning is for the system that made the dirty Duchess possible, that took a woman's stolen private photographs, spread them across the front pages of every newspaper in Britain, had a judge condemn her character in 64,000 words, and then watched as the Duke of Argyll's own documented violence, fraud, and infidelity went unmentioned in the same courtroom. That system did not fail Margaret Campbell. It worked exactly as it was designed to work. She was a woman who had the audacity to behave like a man in a world that had not yet decided whether it was willing to tolerate that. It decided it was not. And the 3-strand pearl necklace she wore in those photographs, the pearl she also wore when she walked out of the courthouse after the judgment was read, became, in retrospect, the most perfectly chosen image of her entire life. The symbol of elegance and restraint worn in a photograph that the court called obscene. The pearl necklace she kept wearing afterward, unchanged, unreformed, refusing the shame that was being offered. She was not going to flinch. Not in the photograph. Not in the courthouse. Not in the nursing home at the end. That much, at least, she kept. If this story made you angry, or made you think, or made you see 1963 Britain, and something about now, more clearly than you did before, subscribe to this channel. This is what we do here. The full story. The real story. The one that requires going past the salacious headline and asking whose interest that headline served. Leave a comment below with what you think the Margaret Campbell story is really about. Because I think it is about something that did not end in 1963, and I think you know that too. And share this video. Because Margaret Campbell spent the last 30 years of her life being the punchline to a story that was told by the people who had the most to gain from making her one. She deserves, at minimum, a different telling. She kept the pearls. We can keep the truth.